On September 14, 1847, General Winfield Scott's army marched into Mexico City, signaling the end of the Mexican-American War. In this week's Lectures in History podcast, University of Texas professor Aaron O'Connell chronicles the war's causes, the divisions it inflamed within the United States, and its lasting consequences for both nations. Listen as he explores how the war reshaped American politics, military strategy, and the debate over slavery in the mid-19th century. More in a moment.
All right, welcome back, everybody. This is American Military History here at the University of Texas, and today we're going to be talking about the U.S.-Mexican War. As we do in most of our classes, we're going to have some themes that we hit each time, and we're going to proceed in a linear fashion of discussing causes, then conduct, then consequences. And along the way, I'm going to try to hit a few points home to drive some themes home that we've been using in the class thus far. So obviously the starting point is what caused this war? And I'm going to use the same metaphor we've been using all semester of a spark and powder, right? Sparks happen when single events cause conflict, but they only catch fire into a massive war when there's gunpowder lying around. And that gunpowder, it can be military gunpowder, it can be geostrategic gunpowder, sometimes it's cultural gunpowder or economic gunpowder. And so I'd like to do all of that in the causes section. I want to talk about the events that start the war, of which there are a few events that could arguably be the spark of the Mexican War. But we have to talk about the underlying structure that caused all those little events to blow up into big events. Conduct we'll do as we've been doing all semester long, trying to understand what battles had larger effects than just were relevant to that one battle. So we'll use the levels of war that we've been operating under in this course, tactical, operational, and strategic, to gauge the effects of a given battle. And of course, we'll have a discussion at the end on consequences and what this war changed. Along the way, I want to hit a few points home. Here are some of the ones I'm going to preview for you. In the conduct section of our classes, we've been talking a lot about the different principles of war. Not because war is entirely scientific, and if you generate mass, you're going to win, or if you achieve surprise, you're going to win. No, it doesn't work like that. But all other things being equal, if you adhere to the principles of war, you're doing better than if you don't adhere to them. So when we used the War of 1812, we talked a little bit about tactical surprise. And when we did the Revolution, we talked about the British failure to have a strategic objective that was consistent. Today, we're going to talk about mass and maneuver. Okay, we're going to talk about mass, the ability to generate effects at a given time and place. It's kind of a fancy word for violence, but it's more specific than that. It doesn't just mean violence. It means generating overwhelming force at a point so that the enemy cannot counter. So it could be by violence. It could be by personnel. It could even conceivably be by money. It's a way of generating power so much in one place that the enemy can't resist. So we're going to talk about mass. And we're going to talk about how privileging mass affects your ability to maneuver. Effects, we're going to use tactical, operational, and strategic. And for any of you that have forgotten or haven't had it sink in fully yet, let me remind you, these are all adjectives. They're just meant to describe effects. A tactical battle only has effects at the tactical level within that one battle. It doesn't affect something bigger. An operational victory or loss or decision now not only affects that one battle or that one day, but the larger campaign or theater to which it is attached. And then finally, if you can attach a moment, a battle, a decision to the overall end of the war, now you're talking about the strategic level, okay? So I'll use those again as I have before. Something new I'd like to talk about, though, is these terms of tactical, operational, and strategic. These are for on the battlefield. But you know what? Generals don't run countries. Presidents do. There is always a political level above the level of the military strategy. And boy, will you see in this war how that political level causes problems for the conduct of the war. You cannot discuss the Mexican War without understanding that politics, literally Democrat Whig politics, partisan politics, affected the conduct of the war, where they would attack, who would be the commander, who got the forces, whether President Polk would let that person stay the commander. All of that has to do not with military abilities on the ground, but on partisan politics in Washington, D.C. Finally, for our discussion, intellectuals have the job of making relevant distinctions. That's what they do. Historians have the job of making relevant distinctions about the past or using the past. That's all we do. I would like to talk about some of the events that happened in this war, specifically because I think they're relevant to present wars that you've lived through. And you will see in this war that there is more than one military occupation. And when U.S. forces have to garrison towns and cities, it creates problems. They have difficulty doing so. They have different approaches to doing so. And all of that, I think, is relevant to any discussion of Iraq or Afghanistan, which were long occupations with numerous problems. But first, let's get into the powder here. The geopolitical causes. If there was geopolitical powder that could explode at the light of a single spark, then that, I think to understand that, we probably have to talk about how Spain loses its empire. Because half of the rationale for this war, whether spoken or unspoken, half of the motivation for it is, we can do this, Mexico is weaker than the United States, we will win this war. President Polk thought it would be a 4-month war. Do you remember the Margaret Atwood quote from The Loneliness of the Military Historian? Wars happen because those who start them think they can win. That's going on in this war, very much so, and it's specific because of that guy up top. Do you remember this last time in the War of 1812? Napoleon. What does Napoleon have to do with our war with Mexico? It is Napoleon's war against Spain starting in 1807, the Peninsular War, that destroys the Spanish economy. It's part of Napoleon's effort to consolidate control over Europe. It has effects on our war, the War of 1812, but it has greater effects on the Spanish Empire. This is it shown at its height. It isn't like this in 1820, but it certainly is all of this. And look, Napoleon invades 1807. By 1811, you start getting new countries. You get 14 new countries in 25 years. 9 of them all go independent in 1821, including Mexico. This is relevant. The simple fact of the destruction of the Spanish economy makes it impossible for them to police their empire. That starts a wave of revolutions and new states. But these new states, and Mexico, I'm now switching to Mexico specifically, Mexico is not united in 1821. It's not united in 1831 or in 1841. It's deeply riven by factions. Liberals versus conservatives, those who want closer relations to Spain, those who want nothing to do with Spain, those trying to create a democracy, those more wedded to old monarchical European trends. This causes a revolving door of presidencies. There's more than a dozen presidencies in the first 2 decades of Mexico's independence. They cannot raise a tax base. They cannot have enough people working and laboring in a modern economy to generate the money for raising armies and military materiel. And there is constant fighting during those 20 years, which causes it to be a very difficult thing to raise armies and to get people to serve in the military and to supply, accoutre, and arm those forces. All of this is essential for understanding why the war happens. If Mexico had been strong or equally strong as the United States, I don't see how much of what follows could have followed. So that's some of the geopolitical powder that's going to ignite. But it's not just geopolitics. There's economics. There's culture. There's indeed just problems internal to the United States that are becoming pressures for war. So I've given you a map here just of the slave versus free balance. Obviously, that's a relevant factor, but I want to be clear. When it comes to the vote for this war, it's almost everybody votes for it, okay? I believe that the vote is 40-2 in the Senate, and I think only 14 people vote against it in the House, okay? So it is a popular war when it starts. It is not this assumed thing that if we go to war, then it will only empower the slave states. That's not so. There are many Whigs that want to expand as well. Expansion is the common goal of both Whigs and of the Democrats in this period. It's the manner of expansion that's at debate, and specifically whether states will be slave or free. But that's not the only one, okay? There are bigger causes as well. President Polk's principal goal with this war is California. He thinks the land we are standing on, he views as largely unpeopled and not terribly productive. But once you get into New Mexico and you get up in the mountains, it's arable, and that's good arable land. And California has arable land for agriculture and, most importantly, excellent ports, right? At the moment that Polk becomes president, I believe you remember this from high school because you all had to memorize 54 or fight, right? President Polk is elected on an explicitly expansionist project. He calls for, and this is a fascinating use of language, the re-annexation of Texas and the re-occupation of Oregon. We had never occupied nor annexed Texas at the time he's making these claims. It's a smart way for him to suggest these lands are already ours, and we're just going to reoccupy them. He wants the coast of California, not just for the land and the settlement, but the burgeoning trade in China. It is maritime trade over to the east that is one of the attractive features of taking California. The cultural pressures are a bit different. Now, I know we all had to learn the term manifest destiny in high school at some point, right? And you probably, maybe you even had to learn the quote that it's our manifest destiny to overspread this continent for there's room for our yearly multiplying millions, right? We've got people. This land is ours by God, yeah? That is a pressure for war. But I want to be clear about it because I don't think it's well understood. This is an explicitly Anglo-Saxon vision. It is deeply anti-Catholic. And indeed, anti-Catholicism is a major factor in this war. I want to read you a bit from the primary source package I gave you had the article that John O'Sullivan coins the term manifest destiny because of this war. But he goes on to say in that, not just the famous quote that this is our land that's been allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions, but specifically he says, there's no way for the Anglo-Saxons to be stopped now. The Anglo-Saxon foot is already on the borders of California. Already the advance guard of the irresistible army of Anglo-Saxon immigration has begun to pour down upon it, armed with the plow and the rifle, and marking its trail with schools and colleges, courts and representative halls, mills and meeting houses. You can hear the language of the Protestant work ethic here, right? That somehow, and this is how they talked about it at the time, the Anglo-Saxon race is superior to other races because they're diligent, we work hard, we, the Anglo-Saxons, are not slaves to the Pope or to European monarchical traditions, both of which they allotted to Mexico. So that notion of we have to do this, it's not just because we have this vision that this land is to be ours. It's a specific vision grounded in a religion which is then recoded as a race. Okay, and you'll see these interesting 19th century races of Germans and Irish when we get to the 1898 war as well. So there's also then, very importantly, political pressures between Dems and Whigs, Democrats and Whigs. Yeah, the party that Jackson reorganized as president and made far more popular, far more Western, less focused on the old Federalist Party that now faded away, and more bellicose than Jefferson's original Democratic Party. This is the party in power. And President James K. Polk is the man who starts this war. He is the man who makes most of the major decisions of this war. And he is not just a Democrat, but a deeply partisan one. He wants only his party to succeed. He is not terribly interested in working with the Whigs, who are a smaller proportion of the electorate. And he will find himself in a difficult position in choosing commanders precisely because of partisan loyalties. So when the war begins, the senior general in the Army, indeed the commanding general of the U.S. Army, is Major General Winfield Scott. Everybody calls him Old Fuss and Feathers because he's very strict and very like, your hat is a quarter inch off. That is important. Like he attends to little details that people find fuss and feathers, right? A bit too strict. That's not who Polk selects to lead the initial battles of the war. He reaches down and finds a colonel who's been breveted to brigadier general. In other words, he's a lower rank and he's a temporary rank. He chooses Zachary Taylor. Now, he doesn't take Scott because Scott is almost certainly a Whig and he is not a slaveholder. And Polk views him as a likely contender for the presidency. And since he's not a slaveholder, he's like, I don't think that guy's a Democrat. So he doesn't want him. Taylor also has no real interest in politics. He hadn't voted in a presidential election yet. He's not interested in politics, but he is a slaveholding Whig, and he will eventually run. Both men will run for president as Whigs. Taylor will be the one that wins. That's who Polk reaches down and elevates to the leadership of the war, specifically to make sure that Scott doesn't get too powerful. Now, I always give you these terms. There's a spark and there's a powder. And if we look through the sparks of the Mexican War, the typical candidates are the acceptance of the annexation of Texas. That's when Mexico breaks diplomatic relations in December 1845. That's when it looks like we're on a path to war. Another spark, which we're going to talk about in just 1 minute, is the Thornton Patrol. That's when talking goes to shooting. But I think it might be better in this case, instead of talking about a spark, it might be better to talk about this whole thing as a smolder. It's a small fire that's brewing the whole time. Even before Mexico goes independent, there are attempts by American filibusters to use force to land and to threaten this land of Spanish Mexico in order to get Spain to relinquish it. That's even before Mexico becomes a state. Once Mexico is a state, I believe you all know from middle school or high school that Mexico invites colonization in. They need more people, they need more tax base, they need a buffer against the Comanche and the Apache that are systematically raiding the sort of 80,000 Mexicans that are in the land that's going to be granted to us in the session. So they want to bring in Anglos at first. Once those Anglos are there are repeated attempts to use force to push back the Mexican government and exert control up to the point of independence. So you have the Fredonia Rebellion in 26, you have the Anahuac disturbances in 32, then finally in 1835, you get the spark of the Mexican Revolution with the attempt to retrieve the cannon at Gonzales that leads to Come and Take It, that leads to the Texas Revolution. But do you see how there are almost every few years, there is an attempt to mix violence with messaging of politics in such a way that I don't think one spark is probably the best explanation for the war. I want to tell you about one more before we get to the two treaties of after the Battle of Saint-Jacques. This sort of combination of using violence and using diplomacy was so rampant that in the 2 years before the war, the president issued orders that said, look, Navy, we may find ourselves in war with Mexico. In the event of war with Mexico, go all the way to the California coast, seize strategic towns. Based on a mixed message passed at sea in 1842, a Navy lieutenant, well, he's a Commodore, but he's in charge of more ships than just one, named Thomas Ap Catesby Jones, misunderstands a raised war scare that's occurring between the U.S. and Mexico at sea. Messages are passed at sea by shouting sometimes. And it's in those conditions that he hears war with Mexico. He thinks war has been declared. The man sails to Monterey, California, lands, takes the town from Mexican authorities a full 4 years before the war begins, and then realizes, oh, we're not at war. He apologizes, he invites all the officers aboard his ship, and he throws a banquet for them, and then he leaves. And he gets in a bit of trouble for it. But the point is not just how embarrassing. The point is there is a combination of preparing for violence, using violence that you can deny through agents, all in an effort to create pressure on Mexico in such a way that I'm not sure it's fair to point to a single spark, like the annexation of Texas, or say the Thornton Patrol. But now, if we could, can we get to the Battle of Saint-Jacques? And we're not going to cover the battle. We have to talk about the treaties. Because everybody knows, if they know anything about the U.S.-Mexican War, they know it starts over a boundary dispute. Right? Everybody knows something to do with the southern border. So I gave you the treaties. I gave you a reading on the treaties. Can anybody open the door to this conversation? And please do wait for a microphone, because they're going to bring a microphone around. But I want to just be clear. What do these two treaties say about the border of Texas? Anybody pick that up in the reading about any specific language about where the actual southern border of this thing called Texas is going to be? Yes, ma'am. Just hold on a second for the, yep, perfect. I think it's on, yeah.
Treaties claim that the boundary is at the Rio Bravo, which is also known as the Rio Grande. Whether or not that's actually the case is debatable, but the treaties specifically state that the Mexicans have to move all of their troops south of the Rio Grande.
Very good. Yes, yes. That's the first treaty. Here, I've got the quotes up here so that we can talk further about them. So it's a weird thing, right? There's this battle. Santa Anna is surprised. He is captured. He is a prisoner. This is him, Santa Anna being presented to General Sam Houston. They strike 2 treaties. The first one is a public treaty. It's published right away. They write it down. They let everybody know about it. And that's the one you just mentioned there. The Mexican troops will evacuate the territory of Texas, passing to the other side of the Rio Bravo del Norte. That's the Rio Grande. Okay, that's really just a statement on how will you get the army out of here now that the battle is over. It is not a statement about a border precisely, is it? But there's also a private treaty. And this private treaty is really, really problematic. Because first of all, Santa Anna says, look, I can't do any treaties. I'm a general and I'm your prisoner. And yes, I used to be the president and I'll be the president again, but I'm a general. I can't make decisions for the government of Mexico in this stead. But they compel, the Sam Houston and the Texians, as they were then known, compel him not just to commit to this public treaty, but a second private treaty, not published. It's quiet. It's meant to be secret. And it says, as long as you get out of here and pass below the boundary as we just described, then at a future date, we will all work for a third treaty, a treaty of normalization, effectively, that normalizes our boundaries and our commerce. And look, that's the only place you get a treaty of commerce, amity, and limits, boundaries, will be established between Mexico and Texas. The territory of the latter, Texas, not to extend beyond, no further south than the Rio Grande. That's where the Texan and later American claim for the southern border of Texas comes from. Now, you all read the treaty, and you read a wonderful little article by the Texas State Historical Association's Handbook of Texas History. What's wrong with this? Can we just pick apart the problems of these 2 treaties as just described? Can anybody notice anything? Eden.
I mean, the Mexican government never really agreed to them.
I'm sorry, can you start all over and hold for the microphone? Sorry. Thank you.
The Mexican government never really agreed to him since it was just the general, right? And even then, even the private treaty, even though it says not to extend, which is still very fuzzy. That's not it's going to be here. It can't be further than here. Very so true. There was always going to be a disagreement on where it actually was.
Very good, very good. Anything else? Anything else that makes this problematic? Simon, you want to wait for the microphone, please?
Well, another issue was that the Texian army refused to release Santa Anna and fulfill their part of the secret treaty. So basically preventing the treaties from being implemented in the first place.
Can I even go one further and say they are holding him prisoner while they're negotiating these treaties? Treaties under duress are not treaties. And this is the reason, as Eden mentioned, it's not just that the Mexican government didn't make or accept the treaty, they repudiate it. The Mexican government says, this is no treaty of any kind. Furthermore, Santa Anna himself said at the time, look, I'll sign what you need me to sign, but this is a treaty, it even says so in the text, between the Texians and Santa Anna, the person, not the country. So he makes them right in there. This isn't even between Mexico and the United States, it's between you and me. So, to recap, yes, there are statements in documents that were then called treaties, whether they are or not, that stated the southern border of Texas shall be no further than the Rio Grande. There's additional evidence that makes it kind of funny, too, because when Texas starts petitioning for statehood, there's a lot of correspondence. And they say, you could probably make the border's the Nueces River, but we might be able to get it at the Rio Grande. So they write about, historically, our borders have always been at the Nueces River. There has been no real settlement below it. And they write down that in their discussion of negotiations of where they should set the border. So those are the principal causes. Now we're going to get into shooting, but you're going to see that the 2 things start blending together because the shooting starts before the war is declared. So here's the disputed territory. This is the issue, the Nueces Strip. Mexico says, we never accepted the loss of Texas anyway. It's still a rebellious republic as far as we're concerned. We do not accept that it's being annexed into the United States. But even if it were, it never went further south than Corpus Christi. That is the boundary of the state of Tejas y Coahuila. So that should be the border. And the Americans say, no, we're taking the Rio Grande. President Polk orders General Zachary Taylor down to not just past the Nueces River, but indeed to the northern, he doesn't say the northern bank, he says move as close to the Rio Grande as practically possible. Taylor interprets that to mean the northern bank of the Rio Grande. Once he's there, he starts building a fort called Fort Texas. It is the presence of that fort and two armies, 3,500 Americans, some thousands of Mexicans, that will lead directly to conflict. The first shots fired happen over here on 25 April on the northern bank of the Rio Grande, and it happens when Mexican forces cross the river. This will become very important for the American president soon, that Mexican forces crossed the Rio Grande and attacked on the north bank, President Polk thinks, is proof that they attacked us. Of course, based on the Nueces Strip map, they believe everything south of Corpus Christi is theirs. So that's the first contact, but it's not the last one. In fact, there are 3 battles and a siege that all occur before President Polk can declare war. And in those early battles, flying artillery makes its debut. So let me take a moment to discuss with you. Again, war has not been declared yet. I got to go on to Thornton Patrol. The flying artillery, sorry, I guess I missed one here. Will come in a minute. So on to the Thornton Patrol. So those attacks happen. They happen right away and lead to conflicts both at Resaca de Palma and at Thornton's, Captain Thornton's patrol is attacked and he loses 11 killed, 4 wounded, and a number taken prisoner. President Polk doesn't know that yet, but he's already made his mind up that he's going to declare war. It happened before. In fact, he had sent a Louisiana congressman to try to negotiate to buy California from Mexico before the war began, the Slidell expedition. When that fails, when Slidell's mission fails, Slidell says to Polk, I think the only thing that will work is a good drubbing. In other words, using violence. Polk agrees. He drafts the war message then. In 1845, he drafts the first draft of the war message for when I go to war with Mexico. By April 25th, Thornton Patrol is ambushed, but Polk doesn't know that. He assembles his cabinet some 12 days later on May 9th, and he tells them he's planning to go to war. He takes an informal vote. His whole cabinet approves. Only one person resists, the Secretary of the Navy, George Bancroft, who will later become a very important historian. He's the only one who says, I wouldn't do it yet. You don't yet have a case for war. Later that day, the news of the Thornton Patrol attack arrives at the White House. At that point, Polk redrafts his war message, adds new language, and that's the message that will go to Congress for the declaration of war. And I want to look at that war message with you and indeed read it, because the facts of the case are dubious, to say the least. Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States and has invaded our territory and shed American blood upon the American soil. She has proclaimed that hostilities have commenced and that the two nations are now at war. As war exists, and notwithstanding all our efforts to avoid it, it exists by the act of Mexico herself. We are called upon by every consideration of duty and patriotism to vindicate with the decision, with honor, the rights and the interests of our country. Mexico attacked us. They crossed the border onto our soil. That's why we're at war. Now, this does not go over well with Whigs. And there are a number of famous people who object to the war. Some of them object right away. Some of them object as the war goes on. Perhaps the most famous story, this story might be apocryphal. Apocryphal means we read it everywhere. We can't actually track down a primary source that proves this happened. This conversation may not have happened. But here's what did happen. Henry David Thoreau, author of Walden, one of the New England transcendentalists, mentee of the great Ralph Waldo Emerson, thinks this war is a disaster. He doesn't like it. He refuses to pay what was an ordinary thing at the time, a poll tax. You had to pay a tax to vote. He refuses to pay it on grounds that he thinks that this war, he will not support the war by giving to the government when it's fighting such a bad war. He's put in prison. He is ashamed, because he only spends one day in prison. He's ashamed to high heaven because one of his relatives pays the poll tax. He didn't want it paid. And he gets out after one day. But the one day he's in there, Emerson did visit him. And supposedly the exchange went like this. Emerson seeing David Thoreau in the cell. David, what are you doing in there? Thoreau back to Emerson. Henry, what are you doing out there? Yeah? So that is not only this sort of symbolic moment of being opposed to the war, But Thoreau will go on to write his most famous essay. I mean, you all learned about Walden because Walden is wonderful in its own right. But it is Civil Disobedience, written because of this war, which comes out in 1849, which will lay out the argument for resisting government peacefully and non-violently when you agree with it, but taking that extra step of saying, standing by and allowing it to happen is a form of complicity. And it's an important work that I urge you all to consider reading at some point. Now, it's not just literary greats that are against this war. Some pretty important politicians are against it as well. This is probably the most famous. He doesn't have the beard here, but I think you recognize Abe Lincoln. He's a one-term congressman from Illinois. He's a Whig, and he gets voted out because of this. It is his position on the Mexican War that destroys his political support and causes him to be chucked from office. What did he do? I'll tell you what he did. He demands to see exactly where the Thornton Patrol was attacked. Now, he won't issue these resolutions. He does it repeatedly. But he will issue it at the end of the war when we're stuck after Churubusco, when we are now waiting, or even, we're not yet there. It's before Churubusco. But it's halfway through the war, and the war is not going well, that Lincoln decides we need to know where this thing happened. He keeps saying American blood was spilled on American soil. Where's the spot? They were called the spot resolutions. I'd like to read the second part here. We ask, Mr. President, whether the spot on which the blood of our citizens was shed, as in his message declared, was or was not within the territory of Spain, at least after the Treaty of 1819 until the Mexican Revolution. So he disputes the Nueces Strip and says, by what logic is this American soil? He does it so much that his opponents start calling him Spotty Lincoln. Polk has to do a number of things to get a vote through in order for this war to pass. Now it passes overwhelmingly. But the reason that it passes overwhelmingly is that Polk tied the vote for the war with the emergency funding for the troops. So there was no way to vote against the war without also voting against funding the army, and that proves very effective in getting people to vote for the war. But it's not even politicians only. There are military people objecting to this war, some of them before it even happens. Colonel Ethan Allen Hitchcock is the most famous. He is the grandson of Ethan Allen, the hero of the Revolutionary War from Vermont. And he is General Scott's adjutant general. He's in charge of administration and paperwork. And they hand out new maps before the war begins with the Rio Grande marked as the U.S. boundary. So they're like, all right, give us your old maps. Everybody take the new maps. And he thinks it's laughable. He's like, they have added a distinct boundary map to the Rio Grande. Let me read the rest of the quote. Our people ought to be damned for their impudent arrogance and domineering presumption. It is enough to make atheists of us all to see such wickedness in the world, whether punished or unpunished. He goes on to say, as for Texas, her original limit was the Nueces and the hills ranging north from its sources. She has never conquered, possessed, or exercised dominion west of the Nueces. He will be later breveted to colonel for heroism at Churubusco. And then this one comes out later. This is not at the time, but this is by a lieutenant fighting in the war, and he wrote a great deal about it afterwards. Let's see if you can figure out who it is. His most famous quote is the one at the bottom. I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the U.S. against Mexico. I thought so at the time, only I had not moral courage enough to resign. But here he's explaining exactly Polk's logic. We were sent to provoke a fight, but it was essential that Mexico should commence it. It was very doubtful that Congress would declare war, but if Mexico should attack our troops, the executive, the president, could announce, whereas war exists by the acts of, et cetera, and prosecute the contest with vigor. Once initiated, there were but few public men who would have the courage to oppose it. Do we know who it is, Kai? Yeah. Wait for the microphone, yeah. Who is this?
Future Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant.
Yeah, that's one of his ranks. What's the one above that?
Oh, President of the United States.
Thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Grant is a lieutenant in this war. In fact, some of the most famous of names in the Civil War, North and South, get their battle chops in this war. This is the first war where we have a professional army and a professional navy with West Point trained officers, supplemented by militia and volunteers. And as you're going to see in a minute, it is that specific expertise that makes a huge difference. Okay. So that's how we get to fighting. It's already started by the time Congress declares war. We attach a spending measure to war declaration to get everybody to support. What we then need is a strategy. How are we going to get Mexico to give up California, at minimum, California and New Mexico? Polk's plan is a pretty decent one. We're going to occupy the strategic towns all across the north. We will threaten them. We'll hold them at risk. Mexico will see they can't defend those towns. They'll sell. They'll be forced to sell. 4 to 5 months is what Polk thinks it's going to take to do this. I'm not going to talk too much about the Navy, but I want to mention a few things about them and about the artillery. So you see that there's little ships all around the major cities: Tampico, Veracruz, Malatan, and San Lucas. Yeah, this is the first time the U.S. Navy is effective, professional, and large enough to actually blockade coasts to prevent commerce from coming in and out to Mexico, which proves very important in denying them resources and supplies for war. Here is just a picture of the ships to give you a sense of what they look like at the time. They're still all sail. We have side wheel steamers as well. There are steam-driven ships where they don't yet have screw engines in the back, but big wheels on the sides. So it's a combination of steam and sail, but sail dominant at this time. And in addition to blockading the coast, they will also be absolutely essential for the landing at Veracruz, which proves decisive in the campaign. In the early battles up in the north, flying artillery is probably the Americans' greatest advantage. Now, it does not mean it flies, does not have wings, does not go in the air. Flying artillery means fast, light artillery pulled by horses with everybody mounted. Okay, so let me explain. Ordinary artillery has the cannons pulled by oxes, mules, or horses, and then people that operate the guns. They don't get their own horses. They're not cavalry. Yeah? Also, guns are heavy, as is the shot. Very, very heavy. So it has to go on roads. It can only go in certain areas. There's all kinds of terrain that's not hospitable to it. So what the Americans figure out is using light 12-pound guns, firing sometimes shot, but sometimes canister, which is basically shrapnel. It's a can filled with stuff that destroys bodies when it explodes. Using these light guns, they're able to outmaneuver and yet still mass fire on the Mexicans repeatedly. You will see in almost every one of these fights, it's a smaller American force against a larger Mexican force. There's advantages to logistics, there's advantages to training, but artillery is a major advantage. The Mexicans are all using older, heavier guns, only firing solid shot. They can't move them as fast, and they certainly can't reposition them on the fly. That's why it's called flying artillery, that you can quickly move an entire set battery of guns to a new position to target the foe.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
So Polk's plan, good as it is, to just hold the North and assume that Mexico will quit, it doesn't work. Now, I should mention there's an entire other theater up in California, which I will cover when we do California, the extermination of the Indians, in our Reconstruction class, okay? So there's a third theater I'm not even covering here. Once that fails, once the plan to just hold hostage fails, you get a second plan. And that second plan under General Taylor is depicted here on the map. The plan is to move from Fort Texas, where they now have a strong position, down to Monterrey and to Saltillo. This is the only road. I'm going to show you a better picture in a minute, but here, let me use the laser. This right here is the only way to get into the interior through the Sierra Madre and attack Mexico City from the north. Look at this map right here. Just to give you a better sense of the mountains. The area we're talking about, right here, okay? You can get through here, and from here you can get down to Mexico City, which is in a giant extinct volcano in the mountains, 6,000 feet or so, yeah? So you have to go there. There are other ways in, but the mountains are deeply problematic. And the Mexicans know this, the Americans know this, and so the first major battle is at the mouth of the Monterrey-Saltillo Road. It's a pass, effectively, the battle for Monterrey. You can see that there is high ground, good for the Mexican defenders, both here on Mount Mitra and then Federation Ridge, all along the south side of the town. The fighting is absolutely brutal. It's house to house. This is where we learn things that people will later learn in Fallujah and Tet, that when you're fighting in urban battlefields, you don't go through the streets, you fight through the houses. So by this point, soldiers are taking lighted artillery shells and throwing them into the houses. They are blasting their way through the walls of one house to get into the next house, because it's the only way to move safely. There's snipers firing down from the top. The decisive battle or moment comes when the Americans cut the road to the north and then force all the Mexican forces into sort of the main plain, and then they, the town square of Monterrey, and then they bring in a 10-inch mortar and start just destroying the forces. That causes the Mexican general to sue for peace. And here comes now the first of 2 armistices that will cause enormous problems. So the battle it caused serious losses on each side. The Americans alone have 800 casualties, and they're 125 miles from their supply. So Taylor says, we will have an armistice. We'll have a pause in the fighting, 8 weeks. You can withdraw. We will re-nourish. That news makes it to President Polk, and he doesn't like that. But the Americans keep Monterrey. In fact, they don't just keep Monterrey, they keep Saltillo, and they are going to keep all the towns in the north they continue to occupy for the duration of the war. And now I'm going to give you a warning that some of the stuff I'm going to read to you is a little disturbing. The problem with holding these towns is Taylor is much junior to General Scott. He's an incredible fighter. He is so brave. In every battle, he sits on his white horse in the most conspicuous spot and lets people shoot at him effectively so that his troops see he's not moving, we can do this. But he's not great with logistics. He's also not that great with artillery or intelligence or anything other than fighting. And what that results in is kind of poor orders to all the troops that are garrisoning the towns. Eventually, there'll be so many problems that he will start appointing governors for the town and start instituting stronger discipline, but the damage is done. So this one comes from Taylor himself. Once the armistice goes into effect, there are problems not with the regular units, but with the volunteer units. And of those volunteer units, probably the largest and most problematic is the Texans. So here's when their enlistment runs out, they offer to stay. Taylor says, no, go home. And then writes, with the Rangers' departure, we may look for a restoration of quiet and good order in Monterrey, for I regret to report that some shameful atrocities have been perpetrated by them since the capitulation of the town. Here's Lieutenant Grant again. Some of the volunteers and about all of the Texans seem to think it perfectly right to impose upon the people of a conquered city to any extent, and even to murder where the act can be covered up by dark. And how much they seem to enjoy the acts of violence, too. I would not pretend to guess the number of murders that have been committed upon the persons of poor Mexicans, but the number would startle you. It doesn't just end up in private correspondence or military correspondence, it ends up in the press. As at Matamoros, at Monterrey, murder, robbery, and rape were committed in the broad light of day. And as if desirous to signalize themselves at Monterrey by some new act of atrocity, they burned many of the thatched huts of the poor peasants. It's thought that the hundreds of inhabitants were murdered in cold blood. It gets so bad that General Scott, not General Taylor, General Scott starts writing about how Taylor can't control his volunteers. So this is him writing the Secretary of War. Our militia and volunteers, if a tenth of what is said is true, have committed atrocities, horrors in Mexico, sufficient to make heaven weep and every American of Christian morals blush for his country. Murder, robbery, and rape of mothers and daughters in the presence of tied-up males of families have been committed all along the Rio Grande. These are the leaders of the war reporting on their own discipline problems. And they were partly of Taylor's own making in Matamoros and in Monterrey. But that's not what angers Polk. What angers Polk is Taylor agreed to armistice. He thought they should have pursued the Mexicans right through Monterrey as they retreated back down to Mexico City and destroyed the entire army. So he drops Taylor and he picks up Scott. Scott, you are now in charge of all operations. You may order Taylor to do what is need to be done. And Scott's plan is very, very different. He is not going to fight through the interior of northern Mexico. He's going to combine naval power with land power to do an amphibious landing all the way in the bottom here at Veracruz in order to march overland to Mexico City and cause the surrender of the capital. Now, this puts the leader of the all Mexican forces, Santa Anna, in really quite a dilemma. Polk had hoped it would all stay quiet, right? He didn't want to reveal his military plans, but Santa Anna gets a copy. He finds out the Americans are landing at Veracruz. He knows where they're landing. He knows when they're landing. Fabulous. Surprise gone. However, he doesn't have the mobility. He doesn't have ships. The Americans are blockading all the ports. His forces are stuck here in the middle of the Sierra Madres and St. Louis de Potosi, and there are Americans above him, Taylor and all his forces up in Monterey, and now Scott is coming down south. What to do? Santa Anna comes up with an interesting plan. He thinks, wait a minute, he gets information that the bulk of the forces, the main effort, is here in the south. That's true. That must mean that Taylor is weak, that he doesn't have as many troops. Santa Anna resolves to move north, attack Taylor and destroy his forces at Monterey, then turn right around, come back down south, defend Mexico City from Scott's campaign. He knows he has time, or so he thinks, because this is very rugged. And how is Scott going to move a whole army over the Sierra Madre? Right? It's going to take time. He's going to have problems with disease and logistics and food and supplies. So he thinks he has time. What he doesn't know is that some of his information was right and some of his information was wrong. So it's true that Taylor lost most of his forces. When Scott takes command, he says, here's the deal. You've got 12,000 now. All 4,000 regulars, they come to me. 4,000 of your militia, they come to me. He is left with 3,500 to 3,800 forces only. And Scott says, go all the way through the passes, set up a defensive position at Monterey. That's your job. Taylor says no. He doesn't say it to him. He goes, okay, and then he ignores the order. He views it as advice. And instead of positioning his troops all the way up at Monterey, he goes 18 miles south of Saltillo. He's supposed to stay here. He comes all the way down here to an advanced guard to guard the entire pass system from any attempt by Santa Anna. And that's where probably one of the most important and surprising battles of the war occurs. That's the Battle of Buena Vista. You can see the terrain. I mean, you can't really see it here, but these things here are deep, deep cliffs. They're rifts that go deep, deep into the ocean. There's very few places to fight, but there is one wide plain where you can get a Buena Vista, a good view. That's where the battle takes place. And it is professionalism, mobility, and firepower that allows Taylor to win. He has only 3,500 troops. He's facing over 10,000. But what does he do? The first thing is, the Mexicans repeatedly try to outmaneuver him. They present feints, hoping to force him to turn off the strategic terrain where he is dug in. He does not do it. Then, because they don't have the best artillery, they don't have the best equipment, they're working with poor levels of skill among their recruits, they march them all in a dense column to generate mass. They want to be able to stop and shoot, and that means you got to keep people clustered together. Well, that makes them a perfect target for American artillery. And General Wool will say after the battle, without artillery, there's no way we could have won. So it is a magnificent success for the Americans, 15,000 against 4,500. Santa Anna loses almost 2,000 forces in this one single battle. He keeps his use of maneuver is poor, and it gives advantages to the Americans. Americans lose 264 killed and about 500 wounded, 450. Once Buena Vista is over, now Santa Anna is rushing south, but with a defeated force, with far less troops, to return to Mexico City to guard against the amphibious landing at Veracruz. Now, this will go on to be one of the most famous campaigns in American military history. It is still taught today, and one of the reasons is it's the first major amphibious assault of American military history. So there's times that people got off boats and got on shore and shot before, but an amphibious assault is more complicated than that. You have to do it at scale. And what they did here is they brought troops, 10,000 troops arrived by ship. They created stackable rowboats. How are you going to get them off the ship but onto the shore? You need landing craft. They did that then by creating a rowboat that could sit 40 people, and then a smaller rowboat that could sit 20 people, and then a smaller rowboat that could sit 10 people. They stacked them in each other. That's how they loaded them on the boats. That's how they got the boats there. Because of the advantage of mobility brought by the Navy, they land virtually unopposed. There is no way to assemble enough forces, even though they know the plan in advance. There is no way to assemble enough forces to resist. And 10,000 land in 2 hours. Immediately, naval and army batteries of cannons besiege the town, fire on the town until it surrenders, which it does. And here, too, we have good evidence really good evidence on how many Americans die in the Mexican War. We have decent evidence on how many Mexican citizens die, Mexican forces die in the war. We have very bad information on how many civilians die. Just isn't counted in the same ways. This is as good as we get. This is again from the New Orleans Delta. The Mexicans variously estimate their losses at 500 to 1,000 killed and wounded, but all agree that the loss among the soldiery is comparatively small, and the destruction among the women and children is very great. So Veracruz taken. Now there's a base of supply. That's great. But they still have to get all the way over Porote, and then past El Piñal, and then to the road that leads into Mexico City. And there are already irregulars harassing them on the march. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning that there are problems of occupation, there are problems of regular and irregular forces. What did General Taylor do? He waited for the problems to come to him. And when they came, he eventually started passing orders to instill better discipline, and he actually got the situation under control through collective punishment. He started punishing if an attack came from a town, his men would go in and treat the town as hostile. That's how Taylor got control over some of the attacks on the towns he was garrisoning in the north. Scott has a bigger problem. He's an army on the march. He needs to eat and water and food while moving, and anybody who gets sick or just breaks their leg, if they fall behind, they're preyed upon by insurgents, by the irregular forces, the mounted militia, which are Mexico's most effective fighters that are not, they are resisting the occupation. So what does Scott do? He issues an order. It's called General Order Number 20, the Martial Law Order. It's very important in the history of military law because what it does is it says all the things that you think would be illegal are illegal. Rape, murder, assault, robbery, desecration of churches, disruption of religious services, and destruction of private property. You can't do any of that. It's all court-martialable. We will create court-martials and try you for it. Well, we had that before, but what he does is he says not just the American soldiers, any American citizen in Mexico, any Mexican citizen. If there is crime and these things happen, we are instituting American martial law in a still ongoing war, and we will hold them to account. It doesn't work perfectly, but it works better than Taylor. What it also does is it controls the poor behavior of troops in such ways that he does not turn more Mexicans against him. He's helped in this by a few things. They bring a lot of money with them. They know they're going to have to provision on the march, and so they're buying food as they go, which actually is appreciated in some of the towns. And indeed, because of the ancient Spanish law, which translates to Mexican law, that gave a whole bunch of rights to the military could basically ignore civilian control in Mexico because of their military rights. He's not doing that. And so it actually creates a situation where controlling the men, his own men, reduces the threat to them. There are several battles. We don't have time to cover all of them, but there's a major fight at Cerro Gordo, there's a fight at Puebla, and then there's a fight at Churubusco. In all of these, the Americans confront a larger force and defeat it through professionalism, better logistics, better control on the forces. Now, after Churubusco, we are right outside Mexico City. Not right, but pretty close. And at that point, his army is exhausted. It is a major battle. He's low on supplies. Now, not Taylor, Scott agrees to an armistice. Guess what? Polk hates it. President Polk can't believe it that all his generals keep stopping the fight. What he does is sends Nicholas Trist to go negotiate the end of the war. Now, this is where the story gets fun, okay? Nicholas Trist is Democratic Party royalty. He is the grandson of Thomas Jefferson by marriage. He was Andrew Jackson's private secretary. He was the consul, in other words, the ambassador to Cuba. And then he is the top bureaucrat. He's the clerk of the State Department. That doesn't just mean paper guy. It means, other than the Secretary of State, he is the senior member of the State Department. That's who Polk sends to go negotiate the end of the war. The army is outside Mexico City, but has not entered yet. Now, Trist is interesting. He speaks fluent Spanish and is actually generally a little bit sympathetic to the Mexican cause. He does not think that this war should result in the complete partition of Mexico. But that's not what makes Polk angry at first. What makes Polk angry is he sent him on a secret mission to go negotiate the end of a war, and it keeps showing up in the press. And I don't mean it's like, oh, Nicholas Trist was seen getting on a boat. No, they like report on the details of the mission. In fact, talk about like the internet of the 1840s. This is all happening in November of 1847. Before the year ends, a novel is published. There's a picture from it, from Averell's The Mexican Ranchero, which is a plot. It's a pulp plot. It's like a fun read about a Mexican ranchero who kidnaps Nicholas Trist, who is at that moment trying to get to Mexico to do his negotiations in order to stop the end of the Mexican War. So it all ends up, it keeps ending up in the press. This is from Polk's diary. I've not been more vexed or excited since I have been president, because everything he's trying to get Trist to do keeps showing up. Once Trist gets down there, he's kind of arrogant. And he and Winfield Scott, Scott's been fighting a war for 2 years, they do not get along. They get in a fight over petty disagreements, and they refuse to speak to each other. Trist doesn't like it that Scott is already, they signed an armistice, so Scott is already talking about negotiations. Trist thinks he should be in charge of the negotiations. Everything stops. President Polk finds out that Trist is being empathetic towards the Mexicans and is resisting. Principally, Polk's favorite goal is to not just get California, but the whole Baja Peninsula. As Scott starts reporting back that Trist is sort of suggesting that the Americans take less, Polk fires him. He says, "You're fired. Get back here. You are no longer in the job." Trist says, "I'm not leaving." And it's very good he doesn't leave, because he's going to negotiate the treaty that ends the war. But once Polk hears that Trist is not doing exactly what he says, he then says, "You know what? War back on. March on Mexico." And he's doing that because he has rather serious political problems at this point. This is the moment when Lincoln starts calling for his spot resolutions in December 47. The Whigs have taken control of the House of Representatives. They say, "We're not going to fund this war unless you end it." And indeed, there's quotes, like if you think that, it's only Vietnam and Iraq that controversial, this is from a Whig newspaper in 1847 in the middle of the war. Where is it? "May the hordes under Scott and Taylor and every man under them be swept into the next world." That's them writing about their own troops because they think the war is unjust. So that leads Polk to say, we got to get this over with, march on the city. Now, the only way, look at this map here on the top, the only way to get into Mexico City is via Chapultepec Castle. This is the Mexican Military Academy. These roads aren't just roads. These are causeways. They are raised and then guarded roads with walls on them for fighting, and there's swamp on all sides. So you have to get to the citadel here in order to get to the roads that will get you into the gates of the city, the San Cosme and the Balan gates. Now, General Scott has got people with him. He's got over 2,000 troops at this point, but that one citadel is guarded by just 800 people. But look at it. It's on a mountain, and it's got walls, and that makes it very good for firing down. So there's only one real avenue of attack on Chapultepec Castle, and it's here. You've got to come up the main, along the long axis of the hill. What happens is a diversion, a very smart move. We don't want all forces concentrated on us, so we're going to set up two raiding parties. One raiding party, the main effort under General Worth, assaults up the flattest part of the hill. But they send a diversion as well, a diversion under General Quitman with Marines attached to it. All the Marines that have been taken off the ships are fighting with Quitman, and they do a diversional attack there, which is simply to move forces. It's not hoping to get up the hill. It's just literally trying to redirect fire away from the main effort. You're going to see why this is important in a minute. So the assault succeeds straight up the shallow side of Chapultepec Palace. Some of the Marines that are in the diversion quit. Some of the Marines run over and join the main effort and rush up into Chapultepec Castle. Once they have Chapultepec Castle, the city raises a white flag the next day. There's no way to defend the city once the Marines get through to the gates and have entrance to the city. But this battle, the Battle of Chapultepec, will remain famous and actually the subject of great deals of myth on both sides of the war, both on the Mexican side and on the American side. So I've got about 5 more minutes before we move to discussion. Yeah, good. But I just want to tell you this so that you can enjoy how the way we remember wars is not always, as we hope from history, an accurate representation of past events. So what happened at that Battle of Chapultepec? It's an Army show. There are some Marines there. They make up 14% of the fighting forces. They're all involved in the diversion, as I just explained. They have so little fighting that actually their uniforms end up being very clean from after the battle. That's why they're going to be selected to be the palace guards in the Palacio Nacional, the halls of Montezuma. It's because they have not fought much and that their uniforms are in better shape that they're chosen for that task. For reasons that nobody understands, the Marine Corps over time decides that at this battle, so many non-commissioned officers, corporals and sergeants, were killed. So many. And so many officers were killed, that it was only the most junior troops that took up the charge and fought their way to success. And the corporals, the non-commissioned officers, were the most important. That's why on all uniforms, if you are a corporal or above, you have a red stripe on your Marine trousers. You can kind of see it, though it's a little fuzzy in these pictures. See the stripe right there? Yeah, okay. Anybody, corporal or above, gets a blood stripe. You see it happening here. That's what's happening in this rather intense picture, that these guys and gals are getting promoted to corporal, and they're getting a blood stripe that they're going to put on their uniforms.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
It's just 100% false. They had stripes on their uniforms before the battle. There's one officer killed in this battle. There's one corporal killed in the battle. I think there are 7 deaths total for the Marines, for the entire force. It did not happen. But it's turned into a story. And it's been a very useful story for the Marines because you take young corporals and you tell them, look, all the way back in 1847, this happened, and you are a part of that. And it was the junior ranks that did all the fighting. So we still use it. But if you go to the Marine Corps History Division webpage, it's very clear. There's no way that this stripe came from this battle. The idea being, in memory of all those non-commissioned officers, we will now apply a red stripe, a blood stripe, to celebrate their deaths. No, it was on the uniform beforehand. The other myth is probably one you've heard of. Who's heard of Los Niños Héroes? Yeah, a few of you. Okay, good. After this battle, there are children guarding the Mexican Military Academy. They are cadets. They are 13, 14, 15, 16, and then there are some professional soldiers. That definitely happened. They definitely fight in the Battle of Chapultepec. They die. However, that turns into a story that these children not only died heroically in fighting for their country, but one of them, Juan Escuta, wrapped himself in the Mexican flag as he was being shot, as he fell off of the Palisades, as he fell to the ground to prevent the Americans from capturing the Mexican flag. And if you go to the Palacio Nacional today, you see that's the mural that's on there of him falling wrapped in the Mexican flag. We have no evidence that happened. More to the point, Juan Escuta, the guy who did die, there's some evidence that he was 20 years old, not 13, and there's some other evidence that he wasn't even at the battle. So it's that part. Were there children? Yes, 1 instructor, 5 cadets. This gets memorialized and commemorated in Mexican history very shortly after the battle. Were there children there? Yes, there absolutely were. Did somebody fall off the top wrapped in the flag and named Juan Escuta? Probably not. But that's not so important. We need stories. We need stories to understand why things are important, and it's pretty clear that I think I can understand. Can you understand why Mexico would use the death of a child as the symbol of this war? It makes sense to me. Okay, so quickly, on to consequences. The taking of Mexico City does not end the war. A guerrilla war breaks out immediately. The forces guarding the Palacio Nacional, the Marines in the halls of Montezuma, who are supposed to be keeping their honor clean, descend into fighting over who did what in the battles and looting the Palacio Nacional and get court-martialed. The war gets more and more unpopular. Meanwhile, Nicholas Trist didn't come home. He stayed. He patched up his relations with Winfield Scott, and he got a treaty negotiated. That treaty negotiated did not include the Baja Peninsula, as you see right here, which infuriates Polk. And he literally, when Trist comes back, he says, you'll be paid not a cent after the day you were fired. This is a garbage treaty. You're terrible at what you did. And then he's like, I'm losing support in the House by the day. I have to get a treaty passed. So he sends that treaty to the Senate. That's the treaty that's ratified. That's how we get the Mexican cession. It's a magnificent success for the United States in terms of resources gained. Obviously, Polk's greatest concern was California. He gets that. But he also gets Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, portions of Colorado. They find gold in California the next year. We find oil in Texas 50 years on from that. The mountains of Utah and Colorado and New Mexico are filled with lead and tin and copper and everything you need for a modern industrial society. More important for Polk, it makes the U.S. a full two-ocean power. He renegotiates an end to the 54 fight problem with Oregon and gains the Oregon Territory at the 49th. Now he has the entire present-day west coast of the United States. The treaty also grants all the Mexicans living in the cession, that's 80,000 people, it says, you are U.S. citizens now. You get full U.S. rights, you get full U.S. property rights. That will not proceed easily. I would like to leave, there's this famous saying about we didn't cross the border crossed us. I would like to bring this whole war home to end the class so that we can get to discussion with a quick reference to the battle oaks. Who's seen them? Battle oaks, the great live oak trees right here on campus. They're the oldest trees on campus. They were here when they set the university up. We don't know how old they are exactly. We know they're over 300 years old, okay? And if you go down to Town Lake, if you go down, just walk around Lady Bird Lake, you'll see trees with a good 9 or 10 foot diameter, which means they're 500 years old, probably. So if that's true, just think about that. Where you are standing right now, trees do move, contrary to popular belief, but they don't cross banks and they don't cross borders. If you are one of the trees on this campus or down in Town Lake that are more than 400 years old, just think of what that means. That means you, Mr. Tree or Ms. Tree, have had 4 passports and you never moved. You started as New Spain, you became Mexico, you became Texan, and then you became an American citizen. So, I think that's probably a pretty good way to move to discussion. The other consequences of the war, Americans lose 13,000 dead. 13,000, mostly from disease, not from battle. It's from disease. Mexicans, probably 50,000. Here are some questions to start us off. We could stay with the sort of things that you're being tested on, yeah? The tactical, operational, strategic. What are the most important battles here? We can always talk about that. We can talk about it in the study sessions as well. I'm a little more interested in the latter 2 questions. What's the most accurate way to describe how this became the United States? Right? History is making accurate representations of past events. That's all we're trying to do. So I'm really curious of what you think the most accurate way to describe how Texas became part of the U.S. is. And a great test for that is to do it the other way. What's an inaccurate way to describe it, right? Sometimes finding the inaccurate way starts to narrow the differences of what's the most accurate way. And then the second one is, what do you make of President Polk's claim that American blood has been spilled on American soil? Would you go so far as to say this is a war started by a lie? That's it for me. Let's take a minute, and if you have, just raise your hand if you'd like to speak, and we'll just take 1 minute so that we can get here with the microphone. Does anybody want to tackle one of these, or just a question or something you're interested in from the lecture? I'm happy to entertain any of them. Kai, over to you.
Could you explain a little bit like how call for fire worked with the flying artillery a little bit? Like how were they able to communicate where they needed the guns?
Right. It's not call for fire. Call for fire is how we fire artillery today and call on a radio. So it isn't that, right? Yeah, it is all by messenger. And a battery would be an officer and then gun crews. And I don't know the degree of their traversing an elevation. Like I don't know I'm just not an artillery expert, how precisely they could move mills and points by turning cranks and stuff. But it was a far more imperfect task than it is once you have rifled shells that can really be aimed. These can't be aimed as well. Yes, sir.
I wonder, is this, to the third question, or the last question, is this sort of an early form of soft power? It almost reminds me of, well, China and Taiwan and how there's sort of reaches and extensions, but not any deliberate action. It seems that here, the border was already disputed, and so they went and American blood is spilled, and they sort of claim that it's on American soil before any proper agreement is set up.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that they've grasped this essential, I think Polk grasps early on this essential truth that the power to define is worth pursuing. So if you can define what constitutes the border, then this isn't an invasion by us. It's a noble defense to repel invasion. So it is, I don't know about the comparison to China, but China's doing something similar in saying that if you look at our 9-dash line, we believe all of the South China Sea has always been China's, which is, there's not much to defend that, but it's the same move there. By saying this is ours, then if anybody does anything in it, we are acting defensively, and that is reasonable, appropriate, and moral. So I think that's similar. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, I missed.
Here.
What role, if any, did the Native Americans of Texas and of Mexico play in this war?
It is nothing like the War of 1812 or the French and Indian War. There are not Indian confederations armed by the United States for fighting in Mexico at all. However, some of the logic of Indian fighting does come into this, and I didn't read all the quotes. Some of the quotes in the primary source packet go into some detail on this. But there are absolutely accounts of civilians being attacked and butchered and indeed scalped. So Americans looked at the indigenous people of Mexico as Indians and therefore treated them the way that they treated Indians in the North. Yes, ma'am, over there in the back.
I want to comment on the third question.
Please.
I think started with a lie is kind of like a little bit strong. I think like falsely justifying it would be a little bit better because I think that he still would have found, like he already drafted a war message beforehand, right? So
Yes.
if not Thornton's ambush, it would have been something else that he would have found.
Indeed, he's doing it before he even knows about the ambush, yeah.
So yeah, I think started with a lie is a little bit strong because he would have found.
Can I push back here? So I agree fully. He's trying to do it anyway. You're right. The difference between a lie, what was your term? You said a
Falsely justified.
Falsely justifying. I'm trying to probe the difference there, right? You can say something that's inaccurate, but we usually reserve lie for when you know the truth but say something other on purpose for another purpose. Do you think that's what's going on here?
I guess, yeah, I guess he didn't know that the ambush was happening like before he had written the thing, so.
Right.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
It is a judgment call. That's why I put it as a question. Like, I don't know what the formal definition of a lie is and the difference between a lie and a falsehood, but it is stronger. And I put it up there to provoke. Let's see. I thought there was somebody else already. Yeah, right here. You had your hand up too.
I have two questions. The first one, and you may have already mentioned this, but do we know where Thornton was ambushed?
Yes. What's your second one? I'll tell you.
And then my second one, it has to do with something different.
Okay, yes, we know exactly where it happened, and they report on it where it happened, and it happened on the northern bank of the Rio Grande. Okay. To Polk, that's a Mexican invasion, because he's insisting the river is the boundary. Everybody, the colonels getting the maps, the lieutenants fighting in the wars, the politicians who are the Whigs, are saying that has never been the border of Texas. Texas has never said that's the border of Texas. You've got two treaties. One of them never went into effect. Both were made while Santa Anna was a prisoner. They were made with Santa Anna, not with the government of Mexico. The government of Mexico repudiated them. You can't use that to say that's the southern boundary. What's your second one?
And then my second one has to do with last class. We talked about how the Federalist Party dissolved.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned to me that most of them became Whigs, right?
Right.
Is it because they're anti-expansion because they just weren't that strong?
So there are both pro-slavery Whigs and anti-slavery Whigs, and there are pro-expansion Whigs and anti-expansion Whigs. On balance, I think the safest way to describe it is that expansion was uncontroversial on its face. Everybody, Whigs too, wanted more land, wanted the United States to spread. But they disagree with the Democrats who want to spread specifically for slavery. And I didn't get into either, I guess I should have at least mentioned. Before the war begins, there's a Wilmot proviso saying, by a congressman, never even goes into effect. It's killed in committee effectively. But David Wilmot says, we're going to go to war in Mexico. Not 1 inch of land should be slave. It should be all free. And boy, does that generate animosity among the slaveholding states. Then, during the holding of Mexico City, while we're waiting for negotiations, there begins an all-Mexico movement where slaveholders start saying, let's take the entirety of Mexico. We're holding their capital. Slavery may spread down the entire state of Mexico. So it's an active fight. But it is not fair to say Whigs didn't want to expand and Democrats did. Okay. They both want to expand. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. I think you're going to get the last question. Yeah, right here.
Do you think that Polk's opinion of this war was why he was not reelected?
No.
Or his stance?
No, I don't think so. No.
Or had nothing to do with it.
Right. He is in ill health and dies shortly after leaving office. He does not. It is a victory for the. Even though it's, as I've shown you, a deeply problematic war, it does not end with people going, "Oh, Polk, how dare you!" It's a massive, massive gain for the United States, and that seems great at the time. But of course, it is a fundamental inability to figure out what to do with those states, with those new territories. That's going to lead directly to the Civil War. It isn't just the existence of slavery, even though we have Northerners who are fundamentally opposed and a number of Southerners who are fundamentally for. It is the decision of what to do with all the territories taken in the Mexican cession that leads to attempted compromise, failed compromise, and then war. I want to leave the class with this. Some of the stuff I've drawn on today is from Amy Greenberg's excellent book, A Wicked War, Polk, Clay, Lincoln, and the 1846 U.S. Invention of Mexico. So I both want to give her a shout out. That's where the fabulous story about the pulp novel that comes out on Nicholas Trist. But here's what she concludes, and I think it's whether you agree with it or disagree with it, it's thought-provoking. She calls it a war of firsts. She says some stuff happened in this war that had never happened before. President Polk War was the first American war against a neighboring republic. There's a legislature in Mexico. There's a president of Mexico. It's not against a monarchical government. The first American war against a neighboring republic, the first started with a presidential lie, and the first that a large number of American people felt guilty about. It also had an explicitly catastrophic impact. It fractured the delicate sectional balance within the United States. So that is a pretty good segue to where we're going next, which is the causes of the Civil War and then the conduct of the Civil War. Thank you so much for being part of this C-SPAN adventure, and I'll stick around if anybody has any questions, okay? Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Lectures in History podcast. To find more of our history programming, visit our website at c-span.org.